Um, there's a funny comedy sketch that comes from a sketch show. I want to make sure I get the name right. It's not an American show. It was a British show. It was called That Mitchell and Webb Look. Some of you may know what it is. But there's a hilarious sketch from it where it opens up on some Nazis. Classic comedy, right off the bat. It opens up on some Nazis, and they are in the middle of their retreat from the Russian front. They're on their way back, and this one Nazi named Hans is on the phone. He's talking military things. He's explaining how the situation is going. And another Nazi comes up to him and says, Hans, have you ever noticed our uniforms before? Have you ever kind of looked at our caps that we wear? Have you ever looked at that? And Hans said, well, I guess so. Why? And he said, well, I'm just noticing that there's a skull on the front of our cap. There's a skull on the front of our cap. And Hans said, well, yeah, there is. So? And he said, well, a skull isn't really the most positive symbol in the world. Why do you think we have that? And he said, well, I don't know. I don't know. And he said, I've also been looking around at our flags, at our banners, our tents, or just everybody else's uniforms as well. And I'm just seeing a lot of skulls. I'm seeing a lot of skulls. And it's just making me wonder about things a little bit. And Hans said to this other Nazi soldier, he said, well, have you been listening to Allied propaganda? Because certainly they would try to make you question what we wear, what we look like, and all these things. And he said, no, I haven't been listening to that. But the thing is, the Allies didn't choose our uniforms. We did. And we decided that we thought skulls were a good idea. And so they're kind of sitting there and they're thinking about it a little bit. And Hans says, well, maybe it's a perfect Aryan skull, right? Maybe that's what it is. And the other one says, well, but why doesn't it have the rest of its face on it? It's just a skull. So they're struggling to reckon with why these skulls are here. And finally, the other Nazi, he turns to Hans and he says, Hans, are we the bad guys? Are we the bad guys? And no, of course not. Of course not. But then they're looking around and they're seeing skulls. They're realizing some of the things and they're like, oh, shoot, we might be the bad guys in this story. We might be the bad guys. Good guys don't usually wear skulls on their caps and parade around these kind of dark images that a lot of the Nazis had. And so they had to reckon with the idea that maybe we're not the good guys that we thought we were. It's a British comedy sketch. It's not real Germans. It's not obviously a fictitious sketch, a fictitious story. But it is interesting because I think it's indicative of how we as humans respond when we're faced with the realization that we may not be the good guys in every single story, in every single situation. Something else that I think about, and we live in Southern California, so chances are you probably have, but have you ever seen a public apology? A celebrity or a person who's in the spotlight that has to come out and they have to say a public apology. And now, as I'm saying, say a public apology, I almost had to say, read a statement, because that's what we all know it is, right? I'm always fascinated to watch public apologies because I find that they're usually either one of two extremes. Either it's incredibly canned, you know that they're reading something that their lawyer and their PR team wrote for them and said, hey, here's this script, don't answer any questions, just read this and you'll be fine. And as they're reading their public apology, you get the sense that this is not a real apology. They don't really feel bad for what they've done. Maybe they feel bad for that they've been caught, but they're just there because they're apologizing. They don't really feel remorse or guilt for what they've done. And so that's one extreme. And then the other extreme is they get really emotional. Really emotional. And what's funny about this, maybe not morbid kind of funny, is that it's not they're really emotional because they feel bad. They're not emotional because they feel sorry. They feel emotion because they're being forced to reconcile with either they're not the good person that they thought they were, or they're having to reckon with everybody else doesn't think that they're the good person that everybody once thought they were. And that's what they're emotional about. They're not emotional because they're sorry for what they've done. They're only, again, emotional maybe because they got caught, because of what they did wrong. And what both of the sketch and the celebrity, the public apologies that we all kind of struggle to take seriously sometimes are representative of is that we as humans don't think of ourselves as bad people. We don't think of ourselves as bad people. We don't think of ourselves as many labels that we might create. We don't think of ourselves as liars, as cheats. We don't think of ourselves as on the scale of judgmental. I don't want to be judgmental. That's a bad label. But all the way to the other end of the spectrum. I'm not racist. I'm not sexist. I'm not a bad abuser person. That's not me. We don't like to put these labels on ourselves because we know in our hearts that we're a good person. We've lived our lives, we've done the best that we could, and yet sometimes in life we're forced to reconcile with the idea that we may not be as good as we think we are. We may not be as perfect as we think we are. When we're caught in the act of doing something wrong, we often default to say, this is not my fault. The devil made me do it. It's somebody else. There's some other external factor that made me do this bad thing. Or we have to wrestle and we have to say, okay, maybe I am a bad person, and then you start getting a little emotional, like a celebrity might. It's because we get confronted with this reality of what we've done. What we may have done may cause us to actually fit the description of somebody who's a bad guy in the story. And yet all of us, in some ways, are bad people. All of us, in some ways, are bad guys. And again, this might be harsh. This might feel harsh on a Sabbath morning, but just bear with me a little bit. We're all bad guys in some extent. This isn't just me saying this. This is biblical. In the Old Testament, in the book of Ecclesiastes, the author says in chapter 7, verse 20, remember, there's no one on earth so righteous as to do good only and never make a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. Nobody's perfect. Wisest man on earth says that. And Paul says in the New Testament, in Romans, he says in Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of God's glory. Everybody is a sinner. Everybody is a bad guy. Everybody isn't as good as they would like to think they are. We are all imperfect. We're all sinners in some way or another. We may be bad people in some respect. And yet, we are here this morning on a Sabbath morning to celebrate a message of hope, to proclaim a Christ and a gospel that somehow gives us hope despite ourselves. Why? Well, because Paul says directly after Romans 3:23, we know Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of God's glory, but yet we don't know the next verse as well. I wish we did. It's Romans 3:24. He says, although all have sinned and fall short of God's glory, now verse 24, but all are treated as righteous freely by his grace because of a ransom that was paid by Christ Jesus. He says it again in chapter 5. God shows his love for us because while we were sinners, while we were bad guys, Christ died for us. You know, I personally loved English classes in high school. I loved the literature. Some people like dissecting frogs and rats. That's not me. I liked dissecting texts. I like dissecting stories. I love figuring out what's going to go where as I'm watching a movie. I have a horrible, crippling curse now that I'm saying, okay, well, this person's probably the murderer, and now this person's going to be doing this. I can't really enjoy the story because I love dissecting it too much. But one of the things that I love about dissecting is that there's a recognition that authors pretty much for all of human history have all accepted that if something is addressed, then it has to be addressed later on. If a character does something wrong, an author doesn't just say they did this thing just for fun and now will go on and continue on with their lives, no consequences, right? It's the theory of Chekhov's gun. If the author takes time to spend a page describing this gun in detail that's on a wall, they're not just doing that for no reason. At some point later on in the book, that gun's going to come back, right? And we think about this the same way with effects, the effects of our actions, the consequences. It's the same way with authors throughout history, no matter the culture, the time, whenever it was written. Authors and storytellers have an understanding that if I do something wrong, if a character does something wrong, I'm going to get what's coming to me. That character is going to get justice. The bill is going to come due at some point. At some point, if you've done something wrong, you're going to get what's coming to you, right? We have an understanding of this as humanity, not just authors, but as humans too. We know that I can't just do something wrong and just never think about that again. Whether it's my guilty conscience, whether it's somebody finding out what I've done, whether I have to go out and make a public apology and embarrass myself, whatever it is, at the end of the day, we know that we're going to get what's coming to us. And so that's why it's difficult for us to swallow the pill, to swallow the idea that we all here are bad people, that we're all sinners, that we've all fallen short of God's glory, and yet we're here to celebrate. Why? Because Jesus treats us all, God treats us all as righteous, as innocent, as good guys. Why? Because we actually did things. We proved Solomon wrong in Ecclesiastes when he said nobody can make no mistakes. Of course not. We didn't do that. I didn't do that. And I'm not here to make any person feel called out. I'm not here to make myself feel called out and make myself feel better by talking about all my issues. We all have issues here, and yet we all are here called righteous. Why? Freely, by his grace, because of a ransom that was paid by Christ Jesus. You see, the story is, yes, your story is no different from any other story throughout history or from any other literary work. It's not that you did something bad and just got away with it. It's that you did something bad and yet Jesus paid the price for you. You see, when we celebrate the Last Supper, when we remember Christ's sacrifice, I think it's easy for us to focus on the individual in the middle of this picture, to focus on Jesus, right? And of course, that's good. We should focus on Jesus in his last days, in his final hours of his ministry. We should focus on Christ always. But sometimes I think it's easy for us to forget these other people in the picture, who are probably not as European as they look in this photo, but that's okay. That's okay. We forget about them and we focus on just what Jesus said because, of course, we do. But yet, this morning, I want us to take a moment before we partake in communion to reflect on the other people in the room. If Jesus had his last meal, his last phone call, and he got to say, okay, this is going to be my last supper, I get to choose who's going to be in the room with me, who I get to spend my time with, this is who he chose. He chose 12 people. Not a lot. And yet, of those 12 people, he didn't pick very well. One of the 12 had to leave dinner early because he had another appointment to betray Jesus for some money, right? Already, 1 out of 12 is not a great choice. Even Peter, who's sitting there, confident that he would never betray Jesus, will just shortly after this deny 3 times that he knows Jesus. Not just say, I've never met the guy. He's swearing oaths and curses, saying, I've never even been associated with this guy, Jesus. That's not my friend. Jesus did not pick his final supper table mates very well. If we take the moment to reflect and to remember who Jesus was in the room with, that's when I think it becomes more powerful to read the words of Jesus and what he said in those final moments. He looked into the eyes of these broken people, of these bad guys, of these people who did not deserve to be eating with him at his final supper, people who didn't really deserve to call themselves his friends, people who didn't deserve to be associated with Jesus, the bad guys. Jesus looked them in the eyes and he said, "Take, eat, this is my body. Take, drink, this is my blood." Is it poured out for just some particular people or maybe my favorite friends in the room? No, it's poured out for you. It's poured out for you who's about to betray me. It's poured out for you who's about to deny me 3 times. It's poured out for you, a sinner. It's not poured out for the perfect people in the world because there isn't any of them. It would have been a pointless sacrifice. Jesus instead looks at the people who, yes, were close to him, but were very broken, mistake-ridden individuals. And those were the people he looked in the eyes and he said, "My body, my blood, this sacrifice, it's for you. It's for you." And so that's what we're seeking to remember here today. While we want to remember the sacrifice that Jesus did, as it's easy for us to do around this time of communion, again, as we're approaching the time of Easter and remembering his death and his resurrection, I want us this morning to also reflect on who the sacrifice was made for. It wasn't just for certain people. It wasn't just for the good guys in the story. It was made for you. The sacrifice was made for you, not you who you want to be, not you who you think you are, not you who other people perceive you to be. Jesus died for you, the heart of who you are. You, truly your truest self. Jesus died and made this sacrifice for you. For you. At this time, I'm going to invite, as we transition into our time of communion, I'm going to invite our deacons to stand and get ready in the lobby. I'm also going to invite Pastor Jeff and our elders up to the front. And as we enter into this time of communion, I know for some of us it may be new, but for many of us it probably is something we've done many times. As you take the sacrifice, as we remember the sacrifice that Jesus made for you, as we remember the price that he paid, as we remember that he was the one who paid the ransom, I invite us all this morning to be reflecting on who he paid that price for, who he paid that ransom for, why it is that you can be here celebrating and praising God with a message of hope this morning. It's because Jesus made that sacrifice for you, for you.